Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Amanda Dye from Beyond Barnard, and we are here today to talk a little bit about experience writing, how to take your experiences from things that you've done to things that are really helpful for the understanding of professional programs. So I am going to quickly share my slides. Doop, doop. And let me see if I can do them in present mode and have that actually work. Fantastic. Okay, let's get started. We're talking today a little bit about the importance of the experiences section, sometimes called the work and activity section, has a little bit different name depending on the application service. But basically, what we want to think about is how you can best use those sections and especially how to use them in complement to other parts of the writing that you're doing in this application process. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the tips that I have for presenting yourself and your experiences in the best light. And then actually the second half of the workshop is some practice. So I'm going to give you some examples and ask you to evaluate those examples. You can do that silently. You don't have to say anything out loud, but I'll ask you to just like read through some examples and tell me what you think about them, and then I will share some of my thoughts. And in that way, hopefully, get folks acclimated to the kinds of things you want to watch out for as you are building this section of your application. So, first things first, tips for how to get started here. First of all, some basics. Centralized application services for health professions programs typically do not accept resumes or CVs. There are some exceptions where programs will ask for a resume or CV to be added supplementally, but most centralized application services will have either work and activities or experience section where you are able to present information that might otherwise appear on a resume or CV with a little bit of a twist. You are given the opportunity to write a little bit of prose about each experience. In AMCAS, you get 700 characters, including spaces. In a lot of the other application services, it's even a little bit shorter, 600 characters in the ADSAS and ACOMAS applications. And in most of these services, you're able to designate some number of those experiences as most meaningful. Some application services have a limit on the total number of experiences that you can include. In AMCAS, that's 15. Some of them do not have an upper limit, so you can include as many as you like. And every application service has preset categories. They do differ from service to service a little bit. Some application services have a really, really, really wide range of different category types, and some are a little bit more narrow. And that really just reflects the kinds of activities that are considered by the admissions committees in those application types. So basically, the reason that I do this workshop every year is because I want to ask you all to reflect on the difference between doing something and then communicating the meaning of that thing in your application, right? The experiences that you've had, the portfolios you've worked really hard to develop, that is part of the battle here. But you can only really derive the maximum benefit from those experiences if you are able to communicate them to a third party effectively. So when professional programs are looking at these experiences, they're looking to see how you've been spending your time, right? They want to have a good sense of, what are the things that are important to you and whether your commitments align with your goals, right? So if I'm a person who's presenting a personal statement that really reflects my desire to work with underserved populations in my career, an application reviewer is going to expect to see that kind of interest reflected in my experiences section as well, right? I am not able to do that as a physician or a dentist yet, but maybe I'm able to do that as a volunteer, etc. And like the personal statement, experiences allow folks to get to know what's important to you, but presents this in a different way from your essay, right? The goal of this section is to be much more comprehensive about the kinds of things that you've done versus in the personal statement, where because you have such limited space, you're not really going to be able to include everything. And it really allows you to focus in on providing comments about specific experiences one at a time instead of doing it in a very sort of holistic way and in the fashion of a personal statement. I will tell you that in my experience, admissions officers do spend time in these sections. When I worked in admissions, this was the biggest part of my time reading an application was always in this section because I was interested in what this person had been doing that had prepared them to enter my program. So again, my little breakdown here is very relevant for you all to keep in mind. We have talked before in previous meetings about personal statements, which are really, really focused on communicating your overall perspective and giving you space to reflect pretty broadly on experiences rather than providing specific information about individual experiences. And now in the experiences or work and activity section, you're thinking about informing the reader about how you've spent your time and providing very activity specific details. Those two things might come together in your secondary applications and interviews as well, but we're really focusing on what can we tell schools about these individual experiences that can communicate your readiness to begin your training program. So when you're choosing experiences to list in your application, there are some things to think about. You want to consider how they represent the breadth of your experience. You want to make sure that you are demonstrating the different facets of your experience. Now, if you're in a situation where an application service doesn't have a limit, great, you don't have to worry about this. But if you have, more than 15 experiences that you might like to list and you are planning to apply to AMCAS, you want to think about, okay, which ones are the ones I want to prioritize, the top 15. Um, think about the level of commitment that you're demonstrating. It is absolutely okay, not just okay, but typical for there to be a mix of activities with different levels of commitment, meaning there might be an experience that you've done for 15 hours a week for a very long period of time. Something like a research experience is often a very hour intensive kind of experience. Or we could be talking about a volunteer experience that's a couple of hours once a week and something that you've done for a semester, right? Experiences with different levels of commitment can be valuable. They can absolutely all contribute to your application. But it is important to have some experiences that demonstrate long-term, which I define as over the course of more than a year, engagement, right? You want to be able to show an ability to stick to things that you really care about. And of course, you do want to consider your hours per week as you're deciding between experiences, right? Showing the things that have been major parts of the way you've used your time are important to represent. Now, when you decide on that list of experiences and then start to enter it in your application service, they're going to provide you with some predetermined categories. You had this in the pre-professional preparation section of the committee application as well, but we have a fairly limited list of preset categories. You're going to see a much bigger world in the application services, and you may find that some of your activities fit into more than one category. So, for example, you could be a leader of a student club that works on, kind of combating structural determinants of health, right? And in AMCAS, you could classify that as a leadership experience, an extracurricular, a social justice activity, right? A lot of different possible things. When you are in that situation, which comes up frequently, of having an experience that might fit into more than one category, I would say you want to think about what the experience meant to you and what you gained from it, right? If what you're writing about really focuses on the leadership aspect of your work, then probably it makes the most sense to classify it as a leadership experience. If there's a situation where there's really genuinely like just deep ambiguity about the category, you feel like it could fit equally in two different places, then I think you want to kind of just make a choice in terms of the category and then make sure that the description that you're writing makes your responsibilities and any outcomes of that work very clear, even if the category label isn't necessarily 100% the perfect fit. When you are calculating hours, many application services will ask you to estimate hours per week over a period of time. They may ask you to calculate your total number of hours. You want to be honest and as careful as you can in your estimation or calculation. Obviously, you may not have kept track of every single volunteer hour, but you should have a good sense of basically like how often, generally speaking, you did something and be able to provide a good faith estimate. The most important thing is that you should never duplicate hours. So, for example, if you have an experience that was, let's say, a clinical research experience, and you are writing about that experience, and you genuinely had like a couple of different sides to that, right? There were some very clinically focused things and some very research focused things. If you want to separate out those clinically focused things, you definitely don't want to duplicate the hours. So you'd want to think, hey, if my hours were 10 hours a week research and 10 hours a week clinical, calculating that way instead of calculating the entire hours for that one entry. And keep in mind that admissions personnel, obviously can do math. So if you are listing a certain number of hours within a particular time period that doesn't seem feasible, that may be something that, could be a problem for your application review. Some application services also allow you to specify multiple date ranges. This is true for AMCAS in particular. So if you have an experience like a research experience that you've done in multiple summers, but not during the academic years in between, it's actually really easy to demonstrate that. Or by contrast, let's say you have a job that you work a lot of hours at in the summer and you still work, but a much smaller number of hours during the academic year. It's also very easy to show that. So if you are in a situation where you don't have those multiple date ranges, it is also possible to kind of conduct or to calculate all of those overall hours and then use the description to clarify. If you don't have the ability to have multiple date ranges, you could say that, your commitment was a particular number of hours during the school year and another number during the summer. When it comes to how many experiences, I would say that most successful applicants tend to have upwards of about 10 entries in this section. I do think that overall it's better to list fewer than to stretch to fit 15 spaces. If you're in a situation where you have 14 and you're thinking, oh, it's going to be better if I somehow break these apart and make it to 15, probably not, really. If you're in the opposite situation of just having too many things to fit into the number of spaces that you have, you can consider grouping experiences together. So I definitely recommend this for experience types like shadowing, awards, hobbies, or sometimes even publications, depending on the specifics there. Because basically, if you have an entry for shadowing, you can list the various kinds of specialties. You can, have a sense of the different date ranges. That way, you're not kind of spending a ton of spaces on activities that are, even if they're not exactly the same, are really similar to one another and can be kind of grouped under the same category. You can also group related experiences together. So sometimes people want to pull out like a poster presentation as a separate entry from research. And if you've got space to do that, that's great. If you don't have space to do that, you could have a research entry that includes a line that says you presented this research at this particular conference. When you are thinking about let's say the sort of more non-traditional experiences, things like work experiences, especially, work experiences that you might be hesitant to include if you think that they're not directly relevant to medicine. I would say if you've worked particularly to help support yourself or your family, it is crucial to include your jobs. Professional programs really do value the ability to balance a lot of different commitments. They want to know about the context in which you've been developing your application. And if you are a person who has needed to work a sort of unrelated job for 15, 20 hours a week very consistently over the course of your academic career, then that's important to be able to share. The exact relevance of the work that you're doing to your career goals is not the primary concern because number one, any kind of job that has you in interpersonal situations or communicating things like that, it's probably going to be building skills that are part of the desired competencies for health professions programs. And your goal in sharing this information is not necessarily to say this job is, sort of the direct preparation for the career I want to have in the future. Rather, it's to extract those broad transferable skills and to help admissions committees understand the context in which you've developed your application. If you've had experiences outside of the US, Those are absolutely valid and they can be included. That could be travel that you've done in the summer. That could be, during a study abroad semester. And could be clinical, could be research, could be any kind of experience. These are absolutely fantastic to include. And the one thing that I would say about experiences outside the US is that you do want to take care with the way that you are presenting them. So thinking about how you frame your response, your remarks. I've often had people say that experiences outside the U.S. were very transformative, particularly, maybe experiences that allowed them to interact with underserved populations or in developing nations. And if you're using language like that, I think you want to be able to justify it, right? So, did you actually transform, and what is different about your subsequent activities or perspective that you took away specifically from that experience? There's also a link here, and I will, of course, share the slides as always, on remembering guidelines about clinical experiences abroad. Health professions programs generally will expect that you only engage in activities abroad that you would be able to engage in the US. Sometimes rules about what students can do are a little bit more flexible in other countries, but that doesn't apply to you because if you're applying to health professions programs in the US, they're going to expect that you have behaved consistently with the expectations of students in the US. I often get questions about kind of experiences that have political valences. I expect to continue to get these kinds of questions as the world continues to develop in the way that it has been the past few years. And these can be a lot of different kinds of experiences, right? In healthcare, particularly since I work in an institution where a lot of people are interested in reproductive health, things like abortion and other reproductive health issues come up often. Many people have volunteered for organizations like Planned Parenthood or research organizations that work on these kinds of issues. We've had students who have applied to medical school after having been part of union organizing, right? There are lots of different things that could be considered political. And if you're considering including such an experience, I don't think that there's a blanket right or wrong answer. I would say that you want to consider why you are sharing this, right? What are the facets of the experience that are important for you to communicate and why? Also, is the experience representative of something that you expect to continue doing through your medical education? This is important so that you know that you are kind of presenting yourself as the person that you're going to show up as to medical programs. And I also often say when people are asking me about these experiences that, any experience could elicit a strong response from a reader, right? There are things that probably don't seem at all politicized to you that might be to a different person. And, I think that the sort of blanket avoidance of anything that has an appearance of, sort of a political nature is not necessarily the best route for everyone, especially if the experiences that you're talking about are really like directly related to your values, right? And so I'd always encourage you to ask if you're considering not including something, um, would you be able to, function normally and happily in a place where something that you consider that important is viewed negatively or is not available or accessible to you? There are reasonable answers to that question in both directions. Similarly, outing experiences, which can be kind of any experience that might give clues to your identities, perhaps your membership in an affinity group for a particular identity, perhaps an affiliation with a religious organization that you're sharing, right? You want to think here about what else you're sharing elsewhere. Is this something that you expect to come up in your personal statement? All right, great. Well, so then there's no real reason to leave it out of your experiences section. So if you're sharing the information or expect to share it in other senses, in other places in the application, less of a decision. And if the experience is something that's really important to understanding your perspective, right? So if I'm disclosing, for example, maybe an experience that might give a clue that I identify as having a particular disability, but my kind of central goal in pursuing a career in medicine has to do with my desire to advocate for disability justice, then it might make more sense for me to share something like that in my experiences or anywhere in my application. When it comes to your most meaningful experiences, again, exactly how this works, you get a little bit of a difference depending on the application service. So in AMCAS, the MD program application service, you can list up to 3 experiences as most meaningful. In ADSAS, the main dental school application service, you can list up to 6. In AMCAS, you get an additional 1,325 characters, right? So you start with a baseline of 700 characters for every experience. If you designate one most meaningful, you get this much bigger space to kind of write a little mini essay about why this experience was important. So this is a space rather than the personal statement where you could tell stories and elaborate on a very specific experience if that information doesn't really fit into the personal statement. I like to encourage people to choose most meaningful experiences that do represent different facets of their portfolio. So I generally wouldn't advise listing only 3 clinical experiences or only 3 service experiences, right? You want to think about how well-rounded you can be. You also may want to consider whether your letters of recommendation can align in some way with these experiences. So, for example, if you are listing a research experience as a most meaningful experience, do you have a letter of recommendation from a supervisor from that? Now, again, this is not a hard and fast rule. You do not have to have a one-to-one relationship between most meaningful and letters by any stretch of the imagination, but it can be a nice alignment in some cases. When it comes to thinking about things that you're doing while your application is pending, you're only going to be able to list activities that you've begun at the time of your application submission. AMCAS will allow you to estimate future hours for things that are in progress. So if I, submit my application in May and I've started a job in April, I can list the hours that I've already completed, and I can have a separate date range of future hours that I expect to complete during the application year. You should expect, though, that professional programs are going to be paying most attention to the work that you have already completed at the time you are submitting your primary application. ADIA ADSAS and ACOMAS only accept completed hours, so there's not an option to do future hours there. You can use, the description spaces to clarify what you expect from the experience. And if you have an experience that you're including in your application that's relatively new at the time you submit your primary, remember that a lot of secondary applications will ask you for more info about what you're up to over the application year, and you may be able to provide more details about ongoing experiences there. Okay, so I'm going to talk really quickly about some techniques for kind of ways to approach the actual writing of these experience descriptions. And then we're going to spend most of the rest of the session going through some examples. So, when writing about experiences, I often recommend starting out with the STAR method, which we talk a lot about at Beyond Barnard for the purposes of writing bullets for a resume or things like that. I actually do think, though, that this is a method that makes a lot of sense to consider for these kinds of pieces of writing. So you want to think about the situation. What is the context? And it's going to have to be pretty concise because you do have a very limited space. What's the context that we're working in here? You want to think about task. That is, what were your responsibilities? What were the things that you were asked to do? Action is one of the most important parts here. What did you actually do? And then results, also critical. You want to think about what you can show that you contributed. You also want to think about results in terms of what you learned from an experience potentially. It's always important to focus on achievements and outcomes rather than listing the tasks themselves. So, for example, when we're talking about research, I very rarely am a strong advocate for listing all of the various lab or analytical techniques that a person has learned or used through a research experience. I think it's much more interesting for the reader to get a sense of overall, what kind of contribution did you make to this work? Was your contribution largely at the bench? Did you have a more creative or experimental design type of role? Those things tend to be most engaging for a reader. And of course, thinking about the things that you actually accomplished is really important. it's helpful if when you are thinking through results, you think about what were your goals in the experience to begin with, right? So this example here is a research example. I try to avoid using terribly, what's the word that I want? Terribly specialized language related to the kind of work. But it's really clear, from the first half of the first sentence, the situation, the task is the second half of the first sentence, right? I designed and implemented language learning experiments to test adults' ability to acquire new speech sound contrasts. Then you think about the action. So what did I do? I recruited this number of participants. I surpassed a goal, and then I analyzed results, et cetera, et cetera. And then final outcome about publication, right? So things like this, keeping it again very concise, keeping it accessible to the reader, all of that tends to be very important. When you are working through these descriptions, and it may take you, a couple of rounds of revision to get somewhere that you are really happy. In all likelihood, you may have to start with a longer response than you're going to have room for and gradually cut things down. Um, don't rely on adjectives. You should use numbers when you possibly can. If you're trying to assert, that you did a great job at something, being able to quantify how that was instead of saying, my excellent research or something like that. You don't need to exaggerate anything about your findings, right? Or your contributions. You are at the beginning of your career, and it's okay for your contributions to some of the activities to be contributions that are clearly that of someone who is new in their professional life. You think about the appropriate level of detail. This tends to be really tough in some cases, especially an experience you've done for a long time that you've had a lot of work in. So always think about what you need to communicate to get across the meaning of the experience. If you are thinking about like this experience that you've done over the course of years, try to boil it down to like, what are you taking away from this that is actually helping you to be better prepared for your professional goals? Those are the kinds of things to focus on. And again, not focusing on minutia, not focusing on like specific lab techniques, or even like, let's say you're writing about a clinical experience where you had some administrative responsibilities and some patient-facing responsibilities. You're probably going to want to play up more the patient-facing responsibilities rather than the administrative ones. Obviously, there's room for different approaches here, but you don't have to list every single responsibility in a role. You should try to prioritize listing the ones that are most relevant for the reader. And with personal statements as well as experiences, revision is important. You want to pay attention to the content, of course, the structure of the response and the tone of your response. It's important to be consistent with your punctuation. I very strongly advocate for using sentences rather than bullet points. I think that it's a nicer experience for the reader to have some prose. Other people differ, and you are, people who can make your own decisions about how you want to approach these sections. I always encourage folks to think about how your experiences are going to contribute to the overall narrative that you are developing in your application, and how you can use these experiences to, again, amp up the context for schools to understand the choices you've made. Okay. So I'm going to take us through some examples. We'll see how much time we have. We might not do all of them now, but basically what I'm going to do is uh, present you with some lightly edited examples that I've taken from previous applicants. So all of the names of people and institutions and identifying details have been changed. What I want to ask you all to do is just to read each of these examples and to make notes on your assessment about strengths and potential weaknesses of each response. So here's the first one. I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read this and see what you think. What do you think is great about this response? What would you change or improve about it? Okay, I'm coming back. Does anybody want to share any thoughts? You're welcome to do so through the chat. Awesome. Okay, thank you. Yeah, a little technical, not super outcomes focused. That is a good, I think, criticism. Positive things that I saw in this response, there is a pretty robust commitment here, substantial, overall time period and hours. I think some of the language here is used that is accessible to non-specialists, and there's a connection to some of the future interests. One of the things that I find a little potentially questionable, this is not necessarily a fatal error, but could be a question that folks raise, is that this isn't the most meaningful activity. Now, it's hard to recognize within, like, without seeing the full activity section. Maybe there are other even more robust research experiences that kind of indicate this person's interest. Uh, but you want to think about like how this is contributing to the story overall. Okay, gonna give you another one. This one is longer, sorry. And so I'll give you a couple of minutes to read through this one. Okay, any thoughts folks want to share on this one? I'll share with you my thoughts. I think there is some good use of quantification here, and I think an appropriate, like, positive level of detail. Some of the questions that I had after reading this experience, because it is presented as the most meaningful activity, but is a relatively short commitment, how does that compare to other most meaningful activities in the application? Are there, other experiences that are being invoked as most meaningful that are showing a longer uh, period of engagement. And I think with the most meaningful experiences, there could be a little bit more of a concise approach, a little bit more structure to the approach. There is a lot of focus on sort of like telling stories and a little bit about details rather than sort of explicitly engaging with the ideas of, why that experience in particular was transformative. I think let's do one or two more. This is the third example. I'm going to give you a minute to read this one. Okay. Any thoughts to share about this one? Yes, thank you. Yeah. So it takes a little while for this person to kind of get to the point or get to their specific contribution to the experience. That's definitely a good thing to watch out for. Um, I think that this is the kind of experience that can really help to tell a story about an interest in public health or global health, which may be important for certain applicants. Um, some of the concerns that I have is, this is categorized as a leadership activity, but we don't get a ton of focus on the leadership aspect of the role. Always with experiences, in developing countries, there can be concerns about, possible volunteerism, meaning, that this is sort of like you're dropping in, you're not really part of a consistent long-term endeavor to help, with the amelioration of the health situation in a particular area, or one that is maybe like very highly directed by the people who are living in that area and being served by the initiative. Um, and this is a little thing, but it can bother people. There is a period missing at the very end. This person ran out of characters, but you could have found one character somewhere else, I think. And make sure to kind of end it on a nice and well edited note. Okay, I'm gonna do this next one. Ooh. Okay, so this one is a work experience. I think this one is important, so I'm gonna give you a second to read this and pause. Okay, any thoughts about this example? Yeah. All right. So we don't get a ton of details about like exactly what they were doing in the course of this experience. I think that that's a fair criticism as well. Some of the other things that I thought, as you noted, the impact on the writer is evident, right? And I think that's probably one of the main goals in including this particular kind of experience. Provides a lot of context about the applicant's background, helps admissions committees understand, the circumstances under which they were developing their application. It also demonstrates the ability to manage a bunch of different kinds of responsibilities in like higher pressure situations, which can be helpful. Some of the questions that I have, the hours are missing here, and that means that we don't have the full context available to us as the reader. And that's especially a little troubling since the time period that the entry covers is quite long, right? And when you have the ability to do multiple date ranges, it's important to be able to do things like be clear about when you were doing what, and particularly when we have experiences where you're kind of talking about things that have been continuous since before you started college, it's helpful to separate the hours that you were doing before college and the hours that you've acquired since starting college. And again, yes, agreed. There's a lot more focus on the person's background and less focus on how, what they did exactly, but moreover, how the experiences have prepared them to achieve their professional goals, right? What are the transferable skills that we could talk about here that might be a better use of the space? Okay, so I'm going to skip the next few. I again will send you all the slides so you can do this exercise at home, and I'm going to go through them really quickly so that nobody sees all of my things. And I'm going to talk through some kind of wrap up thoughts that I have and then open it up for questions. Things that I always like to remind folks as you're workshopping these activity descriptions. Always remember that the best way to demonstrate the uniqueness of your application is really by clearly describing the impact your experiences have had on you in your writing. Nobody else has had your experiences from your perspective, as I often say, and so working hard to make sure that your experiences can show how you have grown, how you have changed, how you have developed as a human being and as a professional is really crucial. Your experiences should help you tell the story to admissions personnel that you want to tell in your application, right? They should work in concert with and complement to your personal statement. They should be able to, highlight the things that are important to you, the values that are drawing you to a career in medicine, and of course, your readiness, right? The skills and competencies that you already possess that you would bring to your entering professional school class. It is always a great idea to invest in this section of the application because it's, I think, the best way to help admissions personnel get a holistic picture of what you care about as a person and as a growing professional. Always take care with the technical language, especially around your research. Not all of your readers are going to be specialists. Even the ones who are may not be familiar with like your specific kind of project. So make sure that every entry is read by somebody who is a generalist and that you get the feedback that like, yeah, I understand this. Or I don't know what this means, or I don't understand the relevance of this. You always want to make sure that that you're appealing to an educated but broad audience. If you are using patient details, this is very similar to something that I said about personal statement writing. I think it's really, really important if you're writing about patients, which is not bad and not uncommon at all, that you de-identify them, right? Use initials, use a pseudonym. Anything that would not be identifiable is important. And when it comes to those details, you should only share what you need in order to make your point. I think sometimes especially in clinical experiences, you may see things that are that really affect you. You know, you may see people under circumstances that are really, really difficult and are very sort of evocative of emotions and things like that. But you should always be thinking, how much of this person's story are you sharing to make your point, right? You want to minimize the amount of information that you are, sharing about another person's experiences, and really think about what you need to tell your story. You should also always be really careful of condescending or like judgmental language or language that could appear to be condescending or judgmental. Take a second look through all of the adjectives that you use when you're writing about people. And also similar to personal statements, if you're writing about an experience that has maybe a negative valence, maybe, you saw an example of something that you don't want to be in the future, try to present that experience in a solutions-oriented way. Talk about, having like, focus less on the details of the negative experience and more on, hey, like this thing inspired me to want to do XYZ in my career. And of course, remember as you are writing these entries not to overgeneralize about the profession, about patients, about, the healthcare system. You are at the beginning of your understanding of the profession, so you do want to appear to be presenting your experiences with a degree of humility. And that's all for my presentation. So I'm gonna stop sharing and come back. And I'm happy to talk through any questions folks have. Yeah, Batya, go ahead.
Hi. Quick question. So, how would you discuss, and if you would discuss it at all, experience that you won't have had much time in by the time of the application?
Yeah, so for kind of future experiences, I think it really depends on the specifics, right? So if you are, let's say, at the start of something that you think is going to be really important for developing your application, and including it doesn't mean sacrificing something important that you've already completed, then you could certainly include an experience that is sort of mostly going to take place in the future. Exactly how you do that technically will depend on the application service that you're using. But I would say that if you're in that position, you might want to write about what you know about what your responsibilities are going to be. You might want to reflect on, early experiences that you've had while potentially acknowledging that you expect to learn a lot more or to grow more through the course of the experience. And you might think about like what growth, what contribution to your development you're hoping for in pursuing that experience. And then, after you've submitted your primary application, likely, it'll be a space of like 6 to 8 weeks before you're actually submitting your secondary application. So you will have had more experience by then, ideally, and you'd be able to respond to secondary questions with some more detail. And then, ideally, if you get interviews, more and more. So you can kind of continue that over the course of the year. Many schools accept updates as well. So, yeah, I think sometimes it can be really hard if it is like genuinely, I'm starting this the day that I'm submitting my AMCAS application. And in that case, you might not include it. But if it's something that you've, had a couple of weeks in and you have a good sense of where you're going, you could choose to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Well, I will, as I said, share the recording and slides with everyone. If not by the end of this week, then early next. And I'm hopeful that you all will be able to use some of these tips to start working through your experiences. Ideally, you're going to be working from the things that you submitted for your committee application as a good starting point, and revising these experience descriptions to maximize their positive impact in your application. Thank you for spending this nice spring evening with me, and looking forward to continuing to work with you all through the application cycle this summer. Thanks, everybody, and have a good night.